Hey, this is Mark Ogni. I'm the Chief Marketing and AI Officer with Competently. And we are here today with Malvika Jethmalani from Atvis Group, Ali Uren from Kickstart, and Rob Slaughter, President of Competently. And today we wanted to talk about AQ, adversity quotient. Now, I think a lot of people look at the context of this topic of understanding people's approach and behaviors oftentimes from three separate camps. IQ has been really a popular camp for many years, the intellectual quotient. EQ, I in fact have a book in my bookshelf just above my desk here, uh, emotional intelligence, and I've studied that in my past as well. And AQ is something that, with this kind of just Russian doll of change happening in the environment, like layer after layer after layer. I mean, we've had a global pandemic and hybrid working and AI, and like all of these things are just hitting us today. I think it was Gartner had identified that employees today are 50% less capable of adjusting to change than they were pre pandemic. And that brings us to AQ, the adversity quotient. Now, one of the things that in my background, and we can use this to start off with, is I think each of these is correct. There's value and there's research and science behind all three, but each of them kind of comes from a slightly different camp. So maybe at first, let's talk about how these things relate to each other. It seems like people don't just bring adversity or adjustment or adaptability to the role, they bring other things. So I see you shaking your head there, Ali. Why don't you, since you volunteered by shaking your head,
Kick it off. Yeah, sure. So for me, AQ is an incredibly important point and a skill set, an attitude, a mindset to develop because we need to look at the whole person. So we bring all of ourselves to work. We can't just say, "Well, you'll leave your private life at the door." We know that it doesn't work, and it's not a fair and reasonable request. So AQ for me is part of the missing piece. It's the piece where we don't just look at the technical skills, don't just look at the power skills, but develop that whole person to be able to make smarter decisions around not just in the workplace, but around their life, right? And as I said, the whole person is what we must be looking at here so that when we are coming into ever-changing, complex times, ambiguity, that we develop the person that's got the skills, the confidence, the capability, the mindset to do that. So for me, I'm excited about AQ. It's a space I've worked in for a long time. But I think we need to be able to say, this is very much a holistic. And I know that's used a lot, but the only way we're going to get durable outcomes and impacts for people and business is to really mature and step into that AQ space as well.
Malvika, why don't you share some insight with us as well?
I couldn't agree more, Ali, with your thoughts. And Mark, you mentioned this earlier. Within a span of 5 years, just 5 years, we've transitioned from a global pandemic to the Great Resignation. Obviously, people, had to figure out remote work overnight, pretty much. Social unrest, record inflation, geopolitical tension and wars, climate disasters, and of course now we have AI, which is, of course, changing and disrupting work and workplaces in so many ways. And my personal belief is that the volume and pace of change will only continue to accelerate. So I think we need to measure adversity or pay attention to leaders' ability to handle adversity or bounce back from adversity just as a function of the environment in which we find ourselves. The other thing I've learned is that adversity doesn't just build character, it sheds light on a leader's true character. So whether you're in a high growth environment or you're experiencing times of volatility in your business, technical skills and strategy will only take you so far. What differentiates great leaders, I think, from okay ones is how they respond when the ground shifts beneath them. And that's where I think the concept of AQ comes in. So measuring AQ, I think, helps you understand a leader's capacity to persevere and adapt and learn under pressure. I think it's a very data driven way to assess how someone metabolizes stress, how they reframe setbacks, and how they stay focused. And it's not just about personal grit, it's whether it's in the boardroom in crisis or during transformation, leaders with high AQ don't crumble easily. They calibrate, they show up for their teams in a meaningful way. And a high AQ leader knows how to meet people where they are. And by doing that, they make people feel seen and heard. They build trust and psychological safety, but they also provide clarity amidst all of the uncertainty. So I think the long and short of it is that measuring AQ helps you support and develop leaders in a way that's aligned with real world pressure and realities.
Hey, Rob, she's brought up a point there with the EQ, and a lot of your background is in the sales environment. I remember you and I spoke a few months ago that there are camps where people are saying like, oh, you have to have a high EQ because you have to be able to relate with a prospect, and somebody else was arguing, well, you have to have agility and the ability to reflect and pivot and change. Could you talk to that for a moment with your experience of um, in that environment about how it's life itself is dynamic, roles themselves are dynamic, and you have to be able to read it and act upon it. I know that you have a strong point of view.
Well, yeah, yeah, coming out of sales, it's really interesting for me. When we started looking at and how do we put together talent 3Q, which is the combination of IQ, EQ, and AQ. You know, it was really important to me that AQ not to be just this, third piece afterthought that was going to be bolted on, a little sprinkling of AQ here, and you're good to go. Off you go. You'll be great. Malvika just nailed so much good stuff. I mean, that people need to go back and listen to how Malvika just rolled out what she rolled out because it's a superpower. Of course, you need to have EQ, you need to have the communication skills and the critical thinking skills, but then to go and then to dovetail into what you said earlier, Mark, about employees today can cope with 50% of the change they could before the pandemic. And we all acknowledge all of these just crazy changes that are happening in the work dynamic right now. But I'm going to be, I guess I'll be the guy that everybody calls out. And I'm not a boomer, I'm a Gen Xer. Okay. And I'm not yelling at clouds right now, but I think that we really need to take into consideration generational trends as well. And I think that's really important, especially around AQ. I think that when we talk about the ability of only manage 50% of the change, we can blame it on events, but there is definitely a cultural underpinning to all this for generations that have never had to overcome a lot, that things have been given a little too easily. And I see it, and I'm not besmirching an entire generation, but there is definitely a different way that younger generations deal with adversity than older generations deal with
Yeah.
adversity. So, yeah.
I see you nodding again. I think that I'll equate that to raising a hand, Ali. Okay.
It is. That's my raising a hand. And if I can just come back to that, I think, this AQ is a skill set that not just leaders need, everyone needs it. This needs
Yeah.
to be, you have to first have it yourself. You can't give what you don't
Yeah.
have. So leaders need to build it, understand their own level, understand their own reality and how they respond. But this must be a given skill set that we measure and that we have as just a supported expectation in our workplaces. And I think that's incredibly important. The other thing too, I think that when we're talking about, we are in an age where generational fluidity is a term that I've created to explain that we need to facilitate the difference, not fear it. And a lot of leaders have said, I don't know what to do with this, I'll just ignore it and go away, right? Like in Australia and US, we have 4, soon to be 5 different generations in our workplaces. This is a very real reality. So we need to be able to facilitate AQ, not fear it. I think you're right. I think it's like a muscle. Yeah, you got to train your muscles. You don't get strong by sitting on the couch eating chips. You actually have to go out and do the work. And I think that this is absolutely the same for AQ. And I know we'll probably talk about how the leaders actually create the environments to support it, but we
Yeah.
need to create the conditions, the environments, and the relationships to normalise this as an
Yeah.
everyday part of how we deliver and experience work. So I just want to add that on to some of the
You know,
points.
you brought
Yeah.
up a really excellent point there around, it's not just something that is innate, that it's a learned thing as well. And I think there's many
100%.
things that impact it. I think culture within an organization, I think cultures regionally, there's so many things that could impact AQ. But why would we had a question we brought up earlier in the day when we were talking was why would we want to measure AQ? And I think that dovetails to your point, Ali, around because you can train it. In Malvika, would you like to take that one on?
Of course, I think you kind of addressed this earlier with the data points that you shared. So um, I just pulled up the Gartner report, which is called the top 5 priorities for HR leaders in 2025. And number 4 on there is change management. And the most common challenges for HR leaders are as follows. 74% of HR leaders say managers are not equipped to lead change. And 73% of HR leaders agree that employees are fatigued from change. And if you agree with the baseline assumption that the volume and pace of change will only continue to accelerate, and the world, at least for a little bit, is probably only going to continue is probably going to continue to be chaotic, then that speaks to why we need to measure AQ. Simply because it's not just a leadership skill, it's a life skill.
Right. 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 And if I could add something real quickly into what Malvika said too, I think that organizations, we talk about how to foster this. I think organizations need to take a look at themselves and give employees the opportunity to take some chances and make some mistakes. I mean, that is really
Yeah.
what I think is also lacking in today's work environment. Everybody is terrified to make an effing mistake. So
Mm,
no one goes out there and challenges themselves.
mm,
And it's it's just it's interesting to see how everybody's just playing it so safe. A
mm.
risk analysis everywhere, and just play it safe and just toe the line. Yeah.
You know, I use that as an example with every team that I've led before. And I have a daughter. She's graduated. She's in college now. And I remember when she was in maybe third grade, we were sitting at the breakfast counter just outside the kitchen, and she'd gotten a really bad grade on a math test. And to that point, she was used to taking a math test where it was timed. It was just you had to go fast. You had to go. So that's what she thought a math test was. Now she rifled through it really quickly and then flipped the paper over and started drawing pictures on it. And I said, well, honey, I think what we did is we figured out that there's this different type of math test. Maybe we should, maybe there's a different way to prepare for it. And when you do it, there's like, and so the takeaway for me is that making a mistake isn't the problem. The problem is if you keep making mistakes. You have to
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
some structure in how she would study, or I would say with my teams, I say try new stuff. We will not always succeed, but what I must have from you is a way to measure success and failure before you start, so that you can come back and
Yeah.
say, you know what, it didn't work, but I think I understand why, and I stopped doing it right away. And but you're raising your hand again there, Ali. So I'm gonna,
I just want, yeah, I do. I really want to talk about this because this is something
yeah,
I get quite excited about. And I don't think I'm quite normal, but for the last 18 years, my wheelhouse has really been about how do we create an opportunity, not from strengths, because you can't do a lot with strengths, but with gaps, threats, and risk. And how do we repurpose that into new value, right? So this is why I get very excited about AQ. A couple of reasons why we need to measure it, yeah? If you want to de-risk the risk to your organization and people, you need to get the data and you need to understand where people are. Yeah.
Yeah.
So by doing this work and doing this analysis, having the conversations, you will see where the risks are before you get surprised by them. And that's incredibly important, right? It's too hard, you know that. It's too hard to respond in a crisis. It's too costly, it's too stressful, it takes too long. When people are stressed, their ability to be creative is lessened. So we need to de-risk the risk. That's the first thing. The other thing I just want to add to that I've seen is that we're actually building, when we build AQ, we start to build the ability to have a really solid succession plan as well, right? So people talk a lot about succession planning, but unless you do this work and have a robust process, environment, conditions, relationships, you can't talk succession. What are you building on, right? So it allows you to do that. And the other thing, we talked about well-being. Yeah, now, Lisa, you talked about the ability to respond to stress and anxiety in a more constructive way. We talk about productivity. People don't show up as their best human when they're stressed, when they're hungover, when they're putting things up their nose because they don't know how to cope with what's going on in the workplace. These are real. I've worked with them. I've seen them. But I can see what also and what comes from difference. So this is much about people's well-being as it is about setting this business up to be commercially viable. You know, it's business continuity too, right? Robbie and I have talked about in other podcasts. We need to spin multiple plates at one time. This
Yeah,
is
yeah,
about people growth and commercial growth. This is about both. And
yeah.
as I said, the more we talk about it, we build that capability across the whole team. And one thing I want to just add before I'll be quiet is off the back of what Mark said. When people say you learn from your mistakes, we've got to call BS on that. You don't learn from your mistakes. You learn from your mistakes when you actually create the conditions to debrief, to understand them, to have an open conversation, and to have the structure in place to do something valuable and repurpose it back into the business to create value. Otherwise, mistakes just sit there dormant. And what happens?
Uh, That's
I'll
such an
happen again.
important point. That's such an important point, Ali. And sorry to jump back in,
No,
Malvika,
you're not.
but I say all the time, I've learned more from my mistakes than my successes, but I fail to always mention I've had mentors that I took those mistakes to, and we discussed those outcomes, those mistakes. What changes could we make? How could we change the outcome? I've been fortunate enough to have that in my career. That's
Mm-hmm.
another thing that I think is really missing in today's work culture is that mentorship paths that we used to have, which
Mm-hmm.
fostered a culture of trust with employees. So thank you for saying that because you're 100%. I so often just say, "Hey, I learned so much more from my mistakes than my successes," but only because I took them to somebody and figured them out together. Yeah,
Thank you for
exactly.
sharing, Rob. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Hey, Malvika, we're talking about the increase of need for AQ. But if this were like, just a triangle sitting on the ground, is it a matter that one end of the triangle is lifting up, or is the shape of that thing changing? In other words, are the required skills of IQ changing or EQ changing? Then how do they relate with the needs that we're talking about from an AQ perspective? You have a point of view. I know we've talked in the past about how AI is shifting from technical IQ skills, to create other needs. But if you could expand, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. I do think that in the age of AI, technical skills are becoming more and more commoditized. And for example, you have access to low code, no code solutions now. There's a lot of the kind of coding that junior engineers used to do is being automated. A lot of the research and work that junior analysts used to do, even in private equity firms, is being automated, for example. So I do think that in this new world, the soft skills that we also refer to as power skills will become more and more important. And I think that I place EQ and AQ in that bucket of power skills.
Hmm.
And going back to Ali's comment, ultimately, this is all about business outcomes, right? If you're not driving business outcomes, then really nothing else matters. And measuring AQ is about exactly that. So when you think about how do you measure AQ and create the right environment to help people develop that AQ and sort of flex that muscle, it's important not just to celebrate the mistakes or the learnings or do the debriefs and the postmortems. It's also important to help people understand that we need to work on the hard stuff and we need to have the hard conversations. That is part of adversity. So I was listening to a podcast a few months ago. It was the Simon Sinek podcast, and he was interviewing Astro. I forget his last name. His first name is Astro. He's the head of Google X, which is the moonshots arm of Google. And he talks about how it's important we tell our teams to work on the hardest parts of the problem first, because the sooner we do that, the sooner we know whether a product is viable or not. And the example that he gave to illustrate this point is, he said, if you were trying to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare atop a 10-foot pedestal, what would you do first? Train the monkey or build a pedestal? The answer is train the monkey, right? Because that's the hardest part of the problem first. And so you work on that problem first. But he says how all over the world, all across multiple companies of different shapes and sizes, people are building 10-foot pedestals. And then we go to these all hands meetings at our QBRs, and we applaud the monkey pedestal team, and we say we're 50% there, and that's what we pay bonuses on, right? And so when you don't measure adversity and reward people for those behaviors, then they work on the easy stuff and they don't really end up handling the hard stuff.
Wow, that's drop the mic. That was really good. I thought you were going to head in the direction where I remember a programmer, a software developer that I worked with, really talented person, but he called it monkey in the cockpit. And so what he was talking about is that when you have a challenge, like something didn't execute properly, you stop. Okay, you don't start iterating changes on top of it, because what he likened it to was the early, orbiting rockets. They'd train a monkey. Hey, at this point, you push the red button, you get a treat. This one, you push the green button, and then they're kind of like somehow controlling it. Well, what happens when they hit adversity is they just start pushing all the buttons. Like, the thing's about ready to blow up, and this monkey's in the cockpit just doing this, and it's not helping whatsoever. So I guess that has something to do with adversity and monkeys. And so, but I liked your story better.
Good analogy there.
uh, Rob, you were going to be in violent agreement with many of the things that have been said between Ellie and Malvika. So why don't you grab the mic for a moment?
No, I think that, I love the fact that we're talking about this. This is so rarely discussed out in the public, out in public in the atmosphere there, because, and if it is, it's just given lip service. I mean, you look at how many times, like, Marcus Aurelius's meditations is cited on LinkedIn and everything like that, and it's lip service, because what people don't understand at the end of the day, it's perspective versus perception. What Marcus Aurelius wanted is people to get outside of themselves and look at the totality, look at the whole, before, and then making decisions, look at what's reality versus what's inside of my head, and so I think a lot of people, miss the point in that. So we we tell people that we're going to help develop these things, but we say, you know what, you got to still do it on your own. And I just go back to the fact that, I really think that internally, besides everything we brought up and this conversation, how great it is, I think that organizations really need to dedicate themselves to addressing this with their employees. And like Ali said, it's something that has to be, we have to develop this as a team, as a group, as a whole. We develop this together. No one's just isolated and out there on an island. And that's the only way to do this. And then we can succeed. We can strive. We can move forward with it. Because I think it is the ultimate, you know, it is the ultimate super, superhero type of thing is AQ. There's no doubt about it. Being from sales, I always like to say is like, it's easy to say that we can train for anything. Of course, we want to have a skill set, and we do want to have people that can communicate and that can think and everything like that. But ultimately, for me, and I've hired hundreds, if not thousands, of people over my career. But ultimately, I want to know what's going to happen when something goes sideways with somebody. What am I going to get when they get punched in the nose? Because we all do. We all get punched in the nose, and what's going to happen? Are they
Yeah.
going to completely fall apart,
Mm.
rock, and then nothing gets done? Or I'm not asking them to, be something more than they are right now, but are they going to address it? Are they going to stand there and say, let's figure this out. Let's take some action here. You know,
Can I come off the back of that just briefly? It's one of the reasons why, too, Rob, in my work, when developing roles and developing people and teams, I'm not interested so much in the technical skills. I'm interested more in the style and the manner and how the role is delivered.
that's
That
right.
has been right. That's been the game changer, and it comes back
Yeah,
to Malvika's point right at the beginning. Character,
yeah,
great. How's someone going to show up? So
yeah,
much more around style and manner of delivery, of engagement, of relationships, rather than absolute obsession around technical and hard skill as well too. But the combination of both, because that's where you're going to get the story. That's where the narrative is going to be told around and the long-term impacts. Outcomes, we talk outcomes a lot. We know what they tend to be. Yeah, they're more easy to measure, but it's the impacts that tends to make, in my experience, the outcomes durable. And that's all around
yeah,
behavioural attitude, mindset, character, traits, behaviours. So
yeah.
I just wanted to add on to your really good point there,
You know,
Rob,
I'm going to
that
tell a story.
sorry,
Oh,
Mark.
I'm sorry. I'm going to tell a story, and I hope to
Mm,
not get it wrong. And it did happen 10, 15 years ago. But I remember reading about Google was changing their hiring practices from always hiring, the top person from the top, graduate program, because what they found was that these people really knew how to stay within the lanes really well, and they were super intellectual and super bright, but not they didn't color outside the lines far enough. And so innovation was being hampered because to have the skills of painting outside the lines, more EQ and AQ, um, didn't always comport with having super high IQ. So they were hiring for IQ and then found that only the unicorns were able to have those other aspects of the 3Q that actually caused the innovation, that it wasn't just an IQ scenario.
mm,
But I thought it dovetailed nicely with where you were
yeah,
heading there.
yeah, yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Mark.
So I had a note here, like the World Economic Forum in their 2025 Future of Jobs report, they said that the demand for creative thinking, resilience, flexibility, and agility skills were the premium coming through in 2025. And this was the World Economic Forum. Now, I think I'll hand it to Malvika this time. This is really what we're talking about. So it's not just that the four of us are coming together and hypothesizing something kind of cool and having 30, 40, 50 minutes of fun, but expand on that a little bit more if you would. I mean, this is really a known thing.
Absolutely. In the past, resilience building, I feel, happened every few years after sort of major business transformations or, market-led changes. We would kind of dust off our transformation or change management playbooks every few years, right? And today it feels like, at least in my world, it feels like we're flexing our resilience muscle every few months, if not every few weeks or days sometimes, especially recently. And we know from research that resilient organizations drive sustained performance even in volatile environments, and they recover faster from disruptions compared to their competitors. So McKinsey's research has shown that organizations that exhibit resilient traits or behaviors were better equipped to withstand pandemic era disruptions, for example. And I think that when you think about this kind of new world of work, our AI powered world, one of the defining characteristics of this new world is ambiguity, and kind of shifting economic cycles and changing workforce expectations. So we have more ambiguity than ever. And so we're no longer just managing operations, we're navigating complexity daily. And I think that the World Economic Forum report puts a spotlight on this kind of sort of cluster of skills, creativity, resilience, flexibility, agility, all of which I think are core components of AQ. And I think AQ isn't just a measure of how someone handles hardship, it reflects this kind of deeper cluster of adaptive capabilities. And kind of what Rob was saying earlier, right? How does someone react when things go sideways? And so I think of it as the human operating system for dealing with uncertainty. So high AQ individuals reframe problems as solvable. They pivot without losing kind of, direction and the long-term vision and mission. They stay calm and constructive when others in similar positions might freeze or fold. And in my experience, these kind of leadership qualities are not nice to have anymore. They are core leadership capabilities in this new world of work that we're navigating. So if I'm hiring or promoting someone into a mission critical role, I want to know, can they lead through the fog? Can they generate ideas under pressure? Can they help other people stay grounded and optimistic without sugarcoating reality? Can they continuously learn? It's so, so important for leaders to be students of business and students of leadership and students of the environment around them, because again, the pace of change is not slowing down. So we need leaders who don't just cope. We need leaders who can bounce back, who can metabolize change and turn it into momentum. And I think that is AQ in action.
Yeah,
So one of the
that
things
was
you
good.
mentioned,
That was very good.
one of the
Yeah.
things you mentioned reminded me of something that maybe only Rob would remember. Did you ever have a day timer? The
Oh
notebook.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
this was like before you had, your
And then a
notebook computer.
Palm Pilot right
Oh
after
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. I had one of those too. I used to be able to write in graffiti really, really
Malvika has
well.
no idea what we're talking
Yeah.
about right
I
now.
do, I
I,
do.
I do I do know my Palm Pilots. I haven't used one myself, but I've heard of them.
So
uh,
I had a quote. I used to stick quotes in, some of the things where you put business cards or whatever. And one of them was from Indira Gandhi. And it was, there's two types of people, those who get things done and those who take credit for it. I like to be in the former group. There's less competition. And, it was a really good turn of phrase. But I think that really the underlying nature of that conversation had to do with adaptability and adjustment. So, like, getting things done more often involves not just doing the same things faster, because I think, being self-critical of the marketing, uh, group of people these days in a changed environment, they're trying to do more of the same faster, more than they are stopping and saying, wait a minute, is what we're doing right? Are we focused on solving a business challenge, one, and two, are we able to do it in this changed environment? And so I think that those who are really adaptable in this trade in particular is just an example, but I think most trades, most organizations within a company face similar concerns right now.
yeah,
I think it was Mark Savinson had mentioned the other day. We're talking about, um, the 6 months ago, people that were working on supply chain were trying to figure out how you get ships from China to the U.S. Today, they're figuring out, how do I move manufacturing to the U.S. because of trade wars and, tariffs and things like that. The nature of all these roles is changing so much that you can't just apply what you did yesterday and expect it to come up with the right answer today. And it requires,
yeah,
these are just many examples of how
yeah.
AQ is just critical today.
Well, and I'd add this too. Jeff Bezos, when he talks about his two tiers of decision making, they're two-way doors and they're one-way doors. Two-way doors being lower priority, where if you make a mistake, you can go back through and come back. But the one-way doors, once that you make the decision, that's it. And those are the decisions he had to make at his level. And I'm gonna paraphrase, but there was I think he may have been on Joe Rogan or some podcast where he said that those big decisions, those one-way door decisions where, there was no turning back once he made that decision, he made through the lens of agility and adaptability, not through analytics. And he admits that.
He is a unicorn like so few. I mean, I could look at like a Bill Gates or an Elon Musk, where they've been able to go from like low to high and carry this level of performance all the way through. It seems more often than not, leaders struggle to go from a founder stage to a mid-tier stage to an IPO. And it's so cool to see people uh, as some of these examples here, where they've taken it not just through an IPO, but to like global freaking dominance. It's like that's a force of nature. That's a unicorn out there,
Yeah.
and their
Yeah.
ability to deal with the agility is, I think, paramount to their success for sure.
Well, I go back to it once again. It's the perception versus perspective. It's, I think that many people across the board, I would say, are trapped by their perception of what is going on. It's in their head. They're perceiving the world based off their own thoughts, emotions, experiences. Once you leave that and look at the bigger picture, the perspective, other people, how are they reacting to this, what are cause and effects that are going on outside of your perception, the whole thing changes, the paradigm shift. And that's the one thing, and I'm not saying I've perfected it in any way, shape, or form, but it seems to me that these transformative leaders that you mentioned are experts in how to do that, how to get outside of that and look at the totality of the situation and not just how it affects them internally between their own two ears.
So we're coming down to probably the last couple of minutes here, and I just wanted to wrap this up with saying, you know, how can people build AQ, and what can HR and senior leadership do to help others do that? Let's keep
People
going around
start,
the
right?
horn here. You were raising your hand by nodding your head again, so I'll.
Yeah, that's what I do. That's my secret. That's my secret superpower. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, there's a number of things that I've certainly done that have made the difference. I'll mention a couple. Design the roles accordingly. So set the scene early, allow people to have input into that. So people know exactly what's going to happen, how we're going to do that, how do we measure it, what's the expectations, how do we support you. So design the roles to reflect it. Look at the employee trip, look at the journey, look at the touch points. Where do we need to start to weave these discussions, these conversations, these reflections into our day to day? So when we're using one-on-ones, when we're catching up, let's make sure we're making it part of the agenda. When we're having team sessions, when we're coming together, every player wins a prize. Let's make sure that we're opening it up and that this becomes a normal part of when we get together. It's on the agenda and the leader leads. They kick it off, right? No one escapes. Everyone understands the motive and intent behind it. So there are a couple of things that I do that are quite simple and over time compound the outcome and the impact and make AQ a very normal, celebrated part, not feared, of the workplace. That's in a very quick, little, nice, neat box.
Melvika, why don't you take the mic?
Yeah, I would add, totally agree with everything that Ali just said. What I would add to that is it's important for a leader, if you're thinking about developing AQ for yourself, to also learn how to self-regulate under stress. I've worked with hundreds of leaders throughout my career, and um, many of them kind of fall apart in stressful situations. So whether it's things like mindfulness, taking time for self-reflection, even simple routines in your day, and taking recovery seriously. So resilience and AQ are not just about kind of endurance and going and going. You're not a machine, right? I think leaders with high AQ know when to push and when to rest. They are self-aware. And when it comes to kind of developing AQ in leaders across your organization, I would say, use tools like the talent3Q to not just establish a baseline, but to kind of build a common sort of shared language in your organization about this stuff. And once you have a baseline, then you know what your jumping off point is. You know where you stand. You can also then start to understand, what does our AQ look like in different leaders and different teams? Because you'll probably find that it varies across your organization. And then you can use, tools like appreciative inquiry to figure out, what are they doing right over there that we can apply over here? So you can help your leaders learn from each other, and in addition to kind of giving people stretch assignments, etc. Because we are social beings. We learn from each other. So people prefer learning from each other versus this kind of top-down approach. And the last thing I'll say is, it's really, really important for CEOs or leaders at the helm to model transparency and vulnerability. So, Rob talked earlier about how he's learned the most from his mistakes. In one of my CHRO roles, I would share with my team from time to time kind of my failures or my setbacks. And so many of them would come up to me and say, I've never seen a leader do that before, ever. And so I think we need to kind of set the right tone at the top. So, in short, I would say if we need high AQ leaders, we should build high AQ systems. And that's where the partnership between leaders and HR comes in.
Very good. Rob, take us home.
I don't know if there's much I can add to all this. My goodness. I mean, this has been a master class on, identifying and developing AQ. I mean, with Malvika, I just have to agree 100% from the individual level. You need to identify the fact that, stress and anxiety will have zero impact on anything that's ever happened or will ever happen. You need to understand that first. And then to corporately, as Allie hit me between the eyes today, it really is developing that, or not developing, but bringing back that culture of mentoring inside of organizations and sharing and, admitting the mistake is not good enough. How do we move past that mistake and how do we correct it and then drive something positive from that mistake? So, I mean, my gosh, this has been fantastic.
Well, thank you, everyone. I had a great time. These honestly are fun. So let's do it again real soon. And thank you, Malvika.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Rob. Had a great time, and we'll make it again soon. Take care.
Anytime we can talk about monkeys, I'm in. All right.
Cool.
I'm with you.
All right.
Go well, everyone.
All
Thank you,
all
Rob.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.